My name is Caroline Hayes, and I am 41 years old. The day of my brother's wedding was supposed to be filled with joy, but for me, it became the day when years of silence and misunderstanding finally collided with the truth. I remember standing at the back of the church, knowing that something about this day would not end the way anyone expected. I have always been the quiet one in my family, the one who never seemed to fit into the roles my parents imagined for their children. My brother Daniel has always been the golden child, the Marine officer everyone admired, while my sister carved out her own success in real estate. Then, there was me, the one my mother spoke of with polite but dismissive words, as if my life were something she could reduce to a single, disappointing story. I kept my distance at family gatherings because I knew how the conversations would unfold. They had their version of me, and I had learned not to fight it. What none of them knew was that behind the silence, I carried a truth so much larger than their assumptions. A truth I had protected for decades. On the day Daniel said his vows, that truth was finally going to surface, and I was not sure anyone in the room was ready for it. The church was filled with soft music and the low murmur of voices, the kind of atmosphere that carries both excitement and tension. My brother Daniel stood at the front, polished in his marine dress blues, shoulders squared, and smile steady. To my mother, he was the perfect son, the one who lived out the dream she could proudly display in front of friends and strangers alike. My father sat quietly in the pews, adjusting his tie, never the type to say much at family gatherings. He nodded when expected, offered small smiles, but rarely voiced his opinion. My sister, radiant in her tailored dress, moved through the crowd with confidence, talking about her successful real estate business. She had her own place in my mother's carefully constructed story, the accomplished daughter who lived in a large house and drove the right kind of car. And then there was me. I lingered in the back, as I often did, blending into the shadows so no one would press me with questions that led to awkward answers. My mother had already written my role years ago, the family disappointment, the one who made choices no one understood. To her, my presence at these events was tolerated, but never celebrated. When I was 18, I had the chance to follow the plan my mother set for me. She wanted me to go to college, study something practical, and eventually build a life that looked respectable from the outside. Instead, I enlisted. I chose the uniform, the training, and the path that called me, even though I knew it would cost me her approval. She never forgave me for walking away from the future she designed. Over the years, that choice became a quiet wound that showed itself at every gathering. While Daniel's medals were polished and displayed, my own achievements were ignored, reshaped into something less than they were. My mother told relatives and neighbors that I had a simple job on the water, a way to pass the time but not something worthy of pride. Each time I heard her, it was as if she pressed the same bruise, reminding me of my place in her story. As I stood there, watching Daniel prepare for the biggest day of his life, I felt both proud of him and painfully aware of the gap between how we were seen. He fit the script perfectly, the shining Marine officer marrying a brilliant woman. I was the shadow in the corner, the one people glanced at briefly, and then forgot. The sting of it never faded. No matter how many years passed, no matter what I had done that she refused to see. In that church, surrounded by polished smiles and whispered conversations, I felt the weight of every old wound settle on my shoulders again. The wedding was a stage, and everyone knew their role. My brother was the hero. My sister was the success. My father was the silent observer. My mother was the director. And I was the mistake, written into the story only because she had no choice but to include me. I was standing near the back of the church when I heard her voice rise above the polite chatter. My mother was holding court with Daniel's new in-laws, her tone warm and confident, the way it always was when she wanted to impress someone. "Oh, that's just Caroline," she said with a little laugh. She spends her days giving boat tours to retirees, pointing out dolphins along the coast. It keeps her busy. The words cut into me like a blade, sharp and practiced, a story she had told so often it had become her truth. Mrs. Bennett, Daniel's soon-to-be mother-in-law, gave a polite smile, clearly unsure how to respond. My mother continued without hesitation, as if diminishing me was the most natural thing in the world. She joined the Coast Guard right after high school. College was too much for her, so she settled for a little job on the water. It's nothing glamorous, but it keeps her out of trouble. Her voice had that familiar lilt of dismissal, the same one she used when explaining away disappointments. I stood frozen, listening, my chest tight. What she did not know, what she never wanted to know, was the truth. 22 years of service, 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars and a Navy Commendation Medal. I had worked my way up from junior officer to commander, overseeing intelligence operations that directly shaped missions across the Pacific. I had led teams, coordinated with allies, and provided analysis that saved lives. Yet in my mother's story, I was nothing more than a woman steering a boat for tourists with cameras. It was not just her words that stung, it was the ease with which she said them. She had spent years polishing this version of me, telling neighbors and extended family that I had no ambition, no real direction, nothing worth bragging about. Each time she told the story, she stripped away the reality of what I had achieved and replaced it with something smaller, something she could control. And every time I overheard it, the weight of her dismissal grew heavier. Mr. Bennett tried to soften the moment, asking if my job on the harbor patrol was challenging. My mother laughed, waving her hand as if the thought was absurd. It's basically water taxi service with a badge. Caroline always had big dreams, but reality has a way of humbling people. Now she's just giving dolphin tours in San Diego. My jaw tightened, and I felt my nails dig into the palm of my hand. I had commanded intelligence divisions on carrier strike groups, briefed admirals on threats that could ignite wars, and handled classified information that most people could never imagine. But to her, I was a tour guide. What made it worse was knowing she believed it. She had told the story for so long that even she seemed convinced it was true. She ignored the medals in my room, the years I was away, the times I came home late at night with eyes still full of what I had seen overseas. She brushed it all aside and decided that her version of me was the only one that mattered. It was easier for her to see me as a disappointment than to face the truth that her daughter had chosen a path she never approved of. I wanted to scream, to step forward and lay out every achievement, every sacrifice, every moment of my career that proved her wrong. But I didn't. I stood still, swallowing the anger, holding back the flood of words that burned at the back of my throat. I had learned long ago that confronting her in public only made things worse. She would twist my words, laugh them off, and walk away, leaving me painted as defensive and bitter. So I stayed quiet, even as my heart pounded in my chest. The irony was not lost on me. I could analyze the intentions of foreign governments, predict troop movements, and advise commanders on how to outmaneuver our adversaries. I could stand in front of a room full of senior officers and brief them on intelligence that shaped strategy for entire fleets. But in the face of my mother's cruel narrative, I stood powerless. She had reduced me to nothing in front of strangers, and I let it happen because I knew the truth could not be spoken there. Her laughter echoed in my ears, each word dragging me further down into the role she had carved out for me. I was the failed daughter, the one who had never lived up to her expectations, the one she explained away with a smirk and a dismissive shrug. And as much as I wanted to believe her words did not matter, in that moment, they did. They mattered because they reminded me that no matter what I had accomplished, to her, I would always be less. As my mother's words sank deeper into me, my phone buzzed against my side. The vibration was short and coded, the kind of message that meant something urgent was unfolding. I slipped it from my pocket and glanced down, my stomach tightening when I saw the alert. The Pentagon. Priority channel. Situation in the South China Sea escalating. I had 8 hours to report to my post, or risk leaving my team without their commander. My pulse quickened as I tucked the phone back into my purse, careful not to draw attention. Around me, the guests were smiling, chatting, filling the church with laughter and light conversation. No one had any idea that thousands of miles away, alliances were straining, and carrier groups were already on the move. I stood in a church dressed for a wedding, while the world tilted toward conflict, And no one could know that I was one of the people responsible for pulling it back from the edge. The weight of it pressed against me. The insult from my mother still burned, her dismissive voice echoing in my head. To her, I was nothing but a woman who wasted her life on meaningless work. She could not imagine the kind of choices I made every day, the classified briefings that revealed threats she would never hear about. She could not see the faces of the young sailors who depended on me, or understand the cost of being the one to carry secrets no one else could know. I stood there, torn between two worlds. In one, I was the invisible daughter who lived on the margins of my family's story. In the other, I was Commander Hayes, tasked with helping shape the response to a crisis that could pull nations into war. Both roles demanded my attention, and both felt impossible to balance. The wedding was just beginning, yet already I was calculating flight times, secure routes, and the minutes slipping away faster than I could hold them. Every instinct told me to walk out the door, get to the base, and prepare my team. But every piece of me that still longed for a place in my family told me to stay. At least until Daniel said his vows. He deserved that moment. And I refused to let my mother's cruelty steal it from him. Still, the clock was ticking. Each vibration of my phone reminded me that somewhere across the ocean, people's lives were at risk, and I was not yet where I needed to be. It was a strange kind of pressure, the kind that made it hard to breathe. I had trained for combat, for decisions that had no right answer, for nights when the line between victory and disaster was measured in seconds. Yet standing in that church, forced to pretend while my mother laughed and lied about me, felt harder. My chest was heavy with the knowledge that I had to leave soon, but no one in the room could know why. The tension coiled inside me, two currents pulling in opposite directions. One was the duty that had defined my adult life, the obligation to answer the call no matter the personal cost. The other was the quiet desperation to matter to my family, to finally be seen for who I really was. I knew I could not have both. Not today. Not ever. And as the organ began to play the first notes of the processional, I braced myself, knowing the storm was only beginning. The reception line was moving slowly, guests shaking hands and offering congratulations as Daniel and his new wife greeted them one by one. I lingered near the edge, hoping to slip away before anyone noticed me. That was when a tall man in uniform approached, his presence commanding enough to quiet the chatter around him. He studied me for a moment, then his eyes widened in recognition. "Commander Hayes," he said with absolute certainty, his voice carrying across the room. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." The words dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and suddenly all eyes were on me. My mother, who had been in the middle of telling another polished story about Daniel's accomplishments, froze. For a long second, no one moved. The silence was heavy, charged, as people processed what they had just heard. My title hung in the air, undeniable and impossible to explain away. I saw Mrs. Bennett's expression shift from polite confusion to surprise, and then to something like awe. My mother's face drained of color, her mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came. The colonel extended his hand, his grip firm and respectful. "I recognized you from the briefing photos," he continued, making it clear that my work was not just a footnote but something that carried weight within the military. "Your analysis saved lives, Commander. You have no idea how many people are grateful." His voice carried authority, and no one dared to interrupt him. The room erupted in whispers, the guests piecing together the realization that the woman they had been told was giving dolphin tours was, in fact, someone far more important. I felt the weight of years of silence shift in that moment, like a curtain being torn down in front of an audience. My mother's carefully constructed story was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I stood tall, not needing to explain or defend myself. For the first time in a long while, the truth spoke for me. The recognition was public, undeniable, and the look on my mother's face told me everything I needed to know. The lie was over. The colonel's voice carried across the room, steady and sure. "Commander Hayes leads intelligence operations for a carrier strike group," he explained, his tone respectful but firm. Her work has been vital in missions that I cannot discuss here, but I assure you many of us owe our safety to her analysis. The crowd leaned in, hungry for details, while my mother stood rigid, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She tried to laugh, a brittle sound that broke in the middle. "No, no, you must be mistaken," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Caroline gives boat tours in San Diego. That's all she does." She looked around as if seeking someone to confirm her version, but the colonel's expression hardened, leaving no room for doubt. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I believe you've been misinformed. Commander Hayes holds a top-level clearance. She coordinates intelligence across the Pacific. She is one of the most respected officers in her field." His words struck like hammer blows, each one dismantling the story my mother had crafted for decades. The murmurs grew louder, guests whispering to each other, their glances shifting between me and my mother. I watched as her carefully built facade crumbled, the pride she had carried like armor falling away piece by piece. My father stared at me as if seeing a stranger, my sister's smile frozen into something hollow. Even Daniel, steady and composed in his uniform, looked shaken, the weight of this revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. There was no way to hide now, no way to explain it away as exaggeration or mistake. The truth stood bare in front of everyone, undeniable and final. For years, she had painted me as a failure. But in that moment, every guest, every in-law, every relative knew the truth. Justice had finally pierced through the lies, and though the sight of my mother's collapse carried a sting of sadness, it also brought a sharp, undeniable sense of relief. Before the whispers even began to fade, my phone buzzed again, this time with the sharp tone reserved for the highest level of urgency. I glanced at the screen and felt the weight of the moment settle on me. It was the Admiral, a direct call. The kind that only came when every second mattered. I answered quietly, my voice steady, despite the stares pressing in on me. "Commander Hayes," came the firm voice on the other end. "Priority Alpha. Wheels up in 4 hours. You're needed immediately." I responded without hesitation, confirming my departure time, then ended the call. The silence in the room was deafening as I slid the phone back into my pocket. Every guest, every relative, every in-law had just witnessed what no one in my family had ever believed. I was someone whose work carried weight far beyond this room. Daniel's eyes locked with mine, his face pale but proud. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his posture, lifted his hand, and gave me a crisp salute. The kind of salute reserved for a superior officer. My throat tightened, emotions swelling in my chest. Behind him, I heard his new bride whisper to him, "She outranks you, doesn't she?" Daniel nodded without breaking his gaze, his voice quiet, but filled with awe. "By several grades. She always has." The moment carried a gravity I could never have forced into existence on my own. My mother sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the truth. My father looked as though the ground had shifted beneath him, but Daniel's salute told me all I needed. For the first time, someone in my family saw me for who I truly was, and in that recognition, the years of silence and dismissal finally cracked apart. I looked around the room one last time, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. My eyes settled on my mother, and for once, she did not meet my gaze. "I never gave tour boats," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "I've spent the last 22 years protecting this country, leading missions you will never hear about, carrying responsibilities you could never imagine." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. I stepped closer, holding her eyes until she finally looked up at me. "You only believed what you wanted to believe," I told her. It was easier to paint me as a failure than to see who I really am. The weight of those words hung in the air, leaving no space for denial. I did not wait for her answer. I picked up my bag, nodded once to Daniel and his wife, and turned toward the door. There was no anger left in me, only release. I walked away without looking back, knowing the story she had built around me had finally collapsed, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane lifted into the night sky. I settled into my seat, the glow of the secure tablet casting soft light across my hands as I reviewed the latest reports. For a moment, I let myself drift, not into the details of the mission, but into the weight I had been carrying for so long. Years of being dismissed, belittled, and rewritten by my own mother, pressed against me. And for the first time, I felt them loosen their grip. I thought about the countless holidays and family gatherings where my achievements were brushed aside with a laugh. I remembered the sting of her words, the way they made me question my worth even when I knew what I had accomplished. I had convinced myself that her opinion did not matter, yet part of me had always waited for the day she might finally see me. That day had come, not with pride, but with shock and silence. And in that silence, I realized I no longer needed her recognition. As the plane cut through the clouds, I found a strange peace in the thought. My value was never defined by her version of me, or anyone else's for that matter. It was shaped by the choices I made, the lives I helped protect, and the responsibility I carried when no one else could. I had always mattered, whether my family understood it or not. Looking out at the endless stretch of night sky, I felt lighter than I had in years. The lie had fallen, and with it, the need to prove myself to people who never cared to listen. The truth was simple, and it carried me forward. Your worth does not live in the eyes of others. It lives in who you are, in what you stand for, and in the courage to keep going even when no one believes in you. That was the lesson I carried with me into the dark, and it was more than enough.